You're coming back into town after a long day of dungeon delving, and all of a sudden, the captain of the guard insults your party, calling you riffraff. Or maybe that goblin alchemist in your party said just the wrong thing to your champion, and the champion is just so upset and wants to do something about it. Well, there's actually a system in Pathfinder, totally optional system, that is a bit of a departure from regular combat, but it is called the Duels subsystem. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. Now, there are times when arguments or conflicts can become just a little bit personal, and you don't want to start a big to do in the town that you go back to all the time. Or it could be that you don't want to involve your whole party basically in a personal struggle or a personal argument. You can go ahead and bring up the dual subsystem. Once again, totally optional, and you can do basically duels any way you want to, but there is a subsystem, and it's very interesting, and it seems like it could be a lot of fun. I could also truly see using this when you're waiting for that one last party member to come online while you're gonna run your campaign for the night. And it's something you could do just to fill a little bit of time if you wanted to see whether your ranger is better than the wizard. Now, if you don't want to start a big major thing in whatever your base city is, a duel is kind of considered a respectable way and a responsible, reasonable way to kind of resolve these individual differences that might come up with an NPC or even within your party. Although, there could be some civilizations where the duel could be considered savage or against the law and order, and therefore they need to be done kind of in secret or maybe outside of the town. Now, there are different types of duels that Pathfinder does have rules for, and these would be basically your combat duels, spellcasting duels, and then there is a mixed duel, although I will say the mixed duel really isn't a separate duel. It's just the melee players just use the combat rules and spellcasters use the spellcasting rules. Now let's go ahead and talk about how you would set up a duel. Now in this optional dueling subsystem, the way you would set up a duel is the participants must willingly agree to do the duel and to abide by its rules. If they aren't willing to actually participate in the duel, then it's just a combat. Now, if one of the duelists would happen to break the rules that you determine at the beginning of the duel, and in truth is caught doing so, then that duelist loses, taking whatever penalties were agreed upon when the challenge was accepted. And if the combat continues when someone is declared a victor, then it just turns into a regular combat. Now, with a duel, it is customary to usually compete alone, and each participant must receive no help from any outside sources. However, you can set up duels where you have pairs or two groups of three, however you want to set it up, or maybe it could be one high level against two or three lower level characters. That's totally fine, and this does kind of account for that, but you could do it as a group or maybe tag teams, any way you wanted to set up a duel. Usually the duels have limited tools. The participants will agree beforehand what those tools are, be they weapons, be they spells, magical items, and the levels of such things that can be used. It could even be things such as the levels of spells that they could use. It would also usually limit it to nothing particularly deadly like poisons, and it could also be the type of weapon. If it was a combat duel, it might exclude ranged weapons or weapons with reach, or you could allow those. It just depends on what you, the people who are participating in the duel, want to set up as the rules. In a spellcasting duel, you might agree upon basically roughly the equivalent number of magic items and a cap on the power. As we were saying, maybe a cap on the power of the items or a cap on the spells that are used. And then you might also limit whether they can use summoning spells or necromancy in order to bring other combatants in, because if you use those, then technically it is not a one-on-one duel anymore. Now, the duration for combat duels usually lasts until basically the first wound or first blood is taken, and in that case, it's when damage is done, or until one of the duelists is knocked out. These are generally not duels to the death. I could see you doing that, although this specific rule set very specifically states until a duelist is knocked out. Now, most duels will allow either one of the participants to yield in the duel, thereby ending the duel immediately, and they concede victory. Although if you do concede victory, it can diminish your social standing or perhaps your reputation. It just depends on how your adventure path or your setting or your homebrew adventure kind of sets up a reputation within that particular adventure. And then there is another little thing that can be set up, which is if it is a duel of talent, it will usually involve maybe 3 turns each or 2 turns each, but whatever you designate the amount of turns, and the duelers display their ability. Here is where we get into where kind of the judging occurs, or adjudication. Most duels are overseen by a third party who ensures that the duelists don't break the rules. Now, there are the rules that you set up at the beginning and agreed to, and whether you inadvertently or you try to cheat, if you break the rules, you lose the duel. Where duels are legal, it's typically a constable or a magistrate or someone in authority in the city. And in other places where duels might not be seen as something they want to occur within their boundaries of their civilization, then a cleric or some other respected figure serves as the judge. And in all these cases, it would usually be the GM who is acting as that judge. Now, with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into combat duels. Now, there's one thing that's said in this particular chapter, and I'll go ahead and put it up here, but it says, unlike other subsystems, a combat duel works almost the same as a normal combat encounter. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do agree with the second part of this, which is the rules require exceptional focus between the two duelists and the third-party arbiter. And my thoughts are that it's actually the arbiter probably has the most important job in a duel. But when you see some of these reactions that come up and even in the spellcasting duel, but in a combat duel and a spellcasting duel, these are not available outside of duels. So you would only be able to do these during the actual duel itself. Now, for a combat duel, you determine initiative before every single round. So you're rolling every single time. And when you're doing these initiative checks, you can either do it by deception, intimidation, or perception, as long as you are trained in those things. And depending on what you roll, will give you a certain reaction. So it is a little bit like playing, I don't know, rock, paper, scissors, or something along those lines, where you will have a reaction that can counteract what the other person is doing. But let's go ahead and get into what these things are. If you roll with intimidation, you basically get a reaction called bullying press. Its trigger is you attempt a melee strike against your opponent, but you haven't actually rolled yet. You would state that you want to do this reaction, and if you hit, your opponent becomes frightened 1. Now here's where the little strategy, kind of the rock, paper, scissors comes in. If your opponent used perception for initiative during that round, when this ability is used, then they become frightened 2 instead. Because they use perception, they're kind of hyper-focused, so this bullying press actually scares them even more. Next one, if you're rolling with deception, is deceptive sidestep, and the trigger is an opponent hits but does not critically hit you with a melee strike. If that's the case, this deceptive sidestep states that you draw your enemy in and pull away at the last moment. The triggering opponent must roll again and take the second result. If your opponent is using intimidation for initiative when the ability is used, they also take a -2 circumstance penalty to the second attack roll. So basically, if they strike on you, you can use this reaction. They have to re-roll. And if they were using intimidation and the bullying press, well, then they would take a -2 circumstance penalty to the second attack roll. It's a little, like I said, it's strategy. And what I mean by the rock, paper, scissors is you're trying to guess what the other person is going to be doing. So in these rolls, you're trying to guess what the other duelist is doing. And then the last one is roll for perception. Roll for perception, then you get a reaction called sense weakness. The trigger is you attempt a melee strike against your opponent, but haven't rolled yet. What happens is you pick a precise moment to attack, giving you an edge. Your opponent is flat-footed against that attack. If your opponent is using deception for initiative and has the deceptive sidestep reaction, when this ability is used. They are instead flat-footed until the start of their next turn. So as opposed to just being the attack, they're flat-footed for the entire turn. Now we'll go ahead and talk about ending a combat duel. The duel ends when the duel's judge confirms the victory condition, or when the judge determines that one of the duelists has gone outside of the rules or cheated, or when one of the duelists yields. And once again, if either one of the combatants decides to continue the fight after the duel ends, like let's say one of the players yields and the character decides, well, I'm going to strike anyways. At that point, you roll for initiative and it becomes a regular combat. Now, one thing I do want to state is that once you're rolling for initiative and you're deciding what you want to roll for initiative on, you are getting those reactions. All your other normal melee attacks and other combat skills you have are still viable. These are just reactions you get specifically in a duel based on what you're rolling for initiative, be it intimidation, deception, or perception. Let's go ahead and move on to a spellcasting duel. Now, spellcasting duels, just like a combat duel, is in encounter mode. However, these particular actions and reactions that you get are not part of normal combat. They only come with a duel. Spellcaster duels are typically more organized than a combat duel, and most spellcasting duels prohibit any sort of melee attacks in combat, and combat is solely spellcasting. They typically have the duelists take turns casting a turn's worth of spells, then give their rivals a chance to counter the spells if they can. So it's almost a battle of wits here. Unlike the rock, paper, scissors, you are actually using your spell book or whatever your spell repertoire is in order to try to cast spells and then counter spells. Now, in most cases, each duelist is going to roll initiative normally, meaning it's not going to occur every single round, and it proceeds in that initiative order throughout the whole entire duel. Now, each duelist can roll for initiative Arcana, Nature, Occultism, or Religion instead of Perception. If they are trained in that skill, they gain the tradition focus of that skill, which allows them to hone in on a certain magical school corresponding to the check they made for their initiative roll. They also gain the dueling counter reaction, which enables a duelist to counter their opponent's spell if their tradition focus matches the tradition of that spell. Now, I will say that before we go any further here, picking the tradition you want to do, you obviously want to pick your strongest one. However, if you would like to counter your opponent's spells, you need to be in the same tradition focus as your opponent. In order to do that, in order to come up with some type of strategy, let's say you picked Arcana at the beginning and your opponent picked Divine. You can use the single action change tradition focus in order to change your focus to another magical tradition as a single action, thereby still giving you 2 more actions on your turn. Now, as you are spellcasters, some are going to have familiars and some are going to have companions. Even if they are allowed in the duel, the familiars and the companions do not have the dueling counter, nor do they have change tradition focus. So let's go ahead and kind of cover what your reaction and what your action can be. So the dueling counter is triggered when your opponent casts a spell from the same tradition as your tradition focus. What you can do is you can expend a prepared spell or spell slot, just depending on whether you're spontaneous or prepared caster, and then you attempt to counteract the triggering spell with the expended spell. If you are not in the right focus as your opponent, if that is what you are trying to do is to counter them, then you can do change tradition focus, which is a single action, and it allows you to change your tradition focus to another magical tradition. Now, just like a combat duel, a spellcasting duel is going to end, and the spellcasting duel ends when the judge confirms the victory condition, when the judge determines that someone has cheated or gone outside of the rules, or when one of the duelists yields. And just like the combat duel, if anybody tries to continue the fight after the duel is over, you roll for initiative and you start a regular combat. Now, when you are mixing a spellcasting duel and a combat duel, you use the initiative rules for combat dueling, but allow the duelist to roll Arcana, Nature, Occultism, or Religion for their initiative checks. So if you are mixing, you have to roll for initiative at the beginning of every single round. The spellcaster will still gain the dueling counter reaction and the change tradition focus action, although the change tradition focus action obviously is going to be less useful simply because they're in combat and it is less likely they're going to be able to counter. So the duel subsystem is a totally optional rule set. Once again, even if you want to do a duel, you could do a duel any way you want to, and you can run it like traditional combat. However, I kind of like this subsystem. Actually, let me take that back. I really like this subsystem because I think it brings a level of strategy that you don't normally see in a combat. Yes, it is a bit different, and yes, the people who are participating in the duel are going to have to learn the rules, but there is an element of strategy to it that one-on-one you're just not normally going to get. In most cases, if you were to have a melee character go up against a spellcaster, they might just get pummeled, but I kind of think that this gives the spellcaster a chance, especially if they don't go first in the initiative order. And once again, I could really see this being fun as just you're waiting for that last person to show up for your adventure, and maybe you want to have two people determine, well, who could win in this particular situation? Give it a shot and see if they like it. I do hope you like this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.